Hello, my name is Dr. Jane Meyrick, and I am a health psychologist that specializes in sexual health and sexual violence, particularly around minoritized voices. Today, we've got another podcast with Hannah Jackson, who is a therapist at SARSAS, Somerset and Avon Rape and Sexual. Oh, you might have to help me with this, Hannah. SARSAS, Somerset and Avon. You do it.
Rape and sexual abuse support.
I almost had
Yeah.
it. I almost had it. It's a long one. And
Yeah.
today, Hannah and I are going to talk about her doctoral research, which is called, actually, this is one of the first questions I was going to ask, but let's introduce you. It's called Parenting Survivors. First, before we get into this, Hannah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. So, as Jane already said, I'm Hannah, and I'm studying for my doctorate in counselling psychology. And I'm a trauma counsellor working at SARSAS, which stands for Somerset and Avon Rape and Sexual Abuse Support. And
Wonderful. You said it so professionally.
I've had a lot of practice. Yeah, and obviously I'm doing my research on well, the title that I've always given it is women's experiences of having and raising a child born from a rape pregnancy.
Just on that title that we tend to use, which is Parenting Survivors, do you want to say a little bit about those conversations we had and the struggle we had to name this experience, which I found really interesting at the time, because we were trying to find a working title for this project, and we ended up with Parenting Survivors. But do you remember the kind of to and fro, like, how do we...
Yeah, and when we were kind of designing this research, we had the support of a survivors forum from SARSAS, which was a group of SARSAS service users who helped us, or helped me, kind of with the wording of certain things. So when we were looking at the participant information sheet and the participant advert, we chose to use the word unwanted sexual experience, or use that phrase rather, because we felt that it conveyed the sort of experience we were looking for without kind of being too in your face by saying we were looking for kind of rape survivors. But I admit that there is a conflict there for me, because in some ways I think and I tend to go nicing it up, what it really is, do we lose the impact and of actually what happened? Do we lose the impact of the trauma that the survivors, that these women predominantly have experienced, and therefore do we make it more palatable and therefore more acceptable within society, when actually this should be something that should be looked at as something that's really terrible, and obviously something that should not happen at all.
So I find I try and use both, having worked with survivors around naming their experience, and some are comfortable with a rape title, others don't identify or find it a struggle to use some of the more brutal or stark words. So I think it's really interesting that it's trying to name something that's never been talked about in a way that's very specific, but also not too abrupt, not too harsh, and that range of how people identify is really a struggle. I think I found it a bit of a... I think it's really difficult that we just had no examples to go with, because there was nothing. So tell me a bit about what drew you in particular to this topic. I mean, you already work with sexual violence survivors, but this was a particular interest of yours.
Yeah, so actually, this topic was born out of my work with SARSAS and survivors, because it was an experience that came up actually in the therapy room. People were coming with having to be parents to children who were born from rape, and the feeling that was expressed was that it was not talked about. There was not a lot of resources for them to look at, and they felt very alone with that experience. And so my research was kind of really born out of wanting to find out more, and wanting to put some information out there, draw awareness to it, and to make them feel not so alone by having the stories of others.
How common do you think it is in your experience and your fellow therapists in a specialist service?
I think it's difficult to say, because I can think of some clients who never outright said it, because the rape occurred within the context of a domestically abusive relationship, so they were in a relationship with this person. And so sometimes it can get confused about, actually, was that rape or was it not? Even, kind of that, what we were talking about earlier with that kind of definitions and how we think about it and how we make it okay for ourselves. So I think it's probably more common than we think, particularly within relationships.
So thinking about what was shocking for me was the lack of research and lack of work. There was nothing, but there is some evidence base. So you've obviously been doing a lot of reading around this because you're going to be writing up an overview. So what were you able to find out from existing research, the little that there was?
So a lot of the existing research has been based in kind of conflict zones and has been based
Hmm.
on women who've experienced rape as part of war, or in particularly in the case of Rwanda, part of genocide. So a lot of the current research was based on those areas. And obviously it's an important area of research, but also you could say that maybe the participants are easier to find in those sort of places because we know that rape is used as a tool of war, basically. There was also a little bit of research as well from American military situations and Haiti, when the UN peacekeepers went in. So there was one or two pieces of research about that as well. And what those research papers tended to find was that actually there was a real mixed bag of kind of relationships with the woman and their child. Sometimes they were able to have a positive relationship, but sometimes the trauma from the rape and kind of wider experience of war, that trauma came through to kind of negatively affect the bond that they had with the child. And added to that, there was quite often a community stigma as well, because in those situations the whole community knew what had happened and knew that this child was a child born of rape, and knew that this woman had been raped. And so there was quite a lot of stigma and exclusion from the community, which quite often again meant that that trauma was kind of harder to get over, because it was constantly kind of being reminded of and being brought up. And there was a kind of big loss for these women, because how rape is seen and how it's seen as then the woman is somehow kind of damaged goods, and so they found it harder to live the life that they wanted to lead, by having a family, having a husband, because of that stigma, being a rape victim and having a child from that rape as well.
So just thinking about the non-conflict environment, there's a bit of research around potential prevalence that's very US based. So what they did there was a kind of a probability sample, so like a generalized sample of about 4,000 women, and tried to track how many were raped and how many of those became pregnant, to try and get a kind of a prevalence of pregnancy from rape. And they came up with something around 5%. And then they said further to that, around 50% of those people chose to have an abortion, but 50% kept the baby. And that was a general one. And these are very models that kind of like, let's try and work it out. There was another one in a more military setting, which is very much clearly younger women, very fit women of childbearing age. And they found about a 9.7, almost 10% rate of pregnancies per rape. So what I did was just a little bit of very bad maths and tried to relate this to the reported rates of rapes in 2021, which kind of gives us a birth rate of around 5 a day, or 1,673 per year, which I found remarkable in its size and silence. And I just hadn't really ever heard anything about this. But speaking more to people, you begin to say, oh, no, 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 within context of specialist services, it's recognized or it's heard of. It's kind of this plot line that's there, but nothing on the surface, which I thought was just so interesting. So tell me, on the basis of not a lot of research, nobody's really done this, what you decided to do with your research study.
So for my research, I really wanted to amplify and focus on the voices and the experiences of the women that this has happened to, and make it something that wasn't so kind of hidden, that wasn't so under recognized. And so with the support of SARSAS, I put out a participant recruitment poster on the SARSAS social media, and it was a very general kind of call for participants, the only criteria being that they had to be 18 plus, so an adult, and had to have been raped and had chosen to keep and raise that child born from the rape. And following people getting in contact with me saying that they wanted to participate in this research, I did interviews with them, so semi-structured interviews where I had a kind of rough list of questions to ask, but we also kind of followed where the participant went, what their experience was like for them, asking questions based on what they said. And I got 8 participants, so we've got 8 interviews.
What were the challenges of that?
So in this case, I got all of my participants were Black women, which was a surprise, especially as I put out the call through SARSAS's website. I was expecting that actually the sort of participants that I'd get would be a larger white population, and actually I'd struggle to reach different ethnicities or different groups within the UK. So the difficulty there was that I'm a white researcher, so we had to consider whether it was right or valid for me to be the only person who was analysing these women's stories, because obviously the analysis would come through kind of my experience and my what we call a lens. And so we thought that there would be quite a lot that I might miss, things that I wouldn't appreciate as much, because obviously I'm not a Black woman and I haven't been exposed to kind of that sort of culture and the norms from their culture. So we decided to get in contact with an organisation called Little Row, and that's a survivor-led Black women's organisation, and they quite often get involved in research as well. So in this instance, we've gathered together a reflective collaboration group who are going to help me kind of with the analysis and help me identify anything that I might miss or wouldn't know
So
about.
what
So
are they actually going to do? Because we're not training them to be researchers. I think it's
yeah,
interesting in how we're
okay.
not trying to bring in an expert lens or saying you need this expertise to listen to these women's stories. They're just going to listen to the stories and tell you what they think is going on.
Yeah, the expertise that we've sought from them is that they are Black women survivors. So we're not training them up in how to do IPA analysis, which is interpretive phenomenological analysis, which is the analysis that I'm using for my research. What we're doing is we're asking them to listen to the audio recordings of my interviews and feedback to me anything that they notice, anything that seems important to them, anything that's specific to the Black community that I might not have noticed. The women in the group are also a variety of different faiths, because faith will seem to be quite important for my participants. So again, I myself am not religious, so coming in, so the reflective collaboration group, I'm also hoping that they'll raise any kind of religious things, important bits that again I might not have picked up because I'm not religious. So I'm we're really asking them for their authentic responses and their authentic kind of thoughts and feelings and things that they notice.
So you mentioned
When they
that you've
listen to
already
these
started your
recordings.
analysis. So without trying to go into too much depth, can you say a little bit
Yes.
about what you think you've found so far? And I'll start you off because what I think was really interesting in what you said is who you did get and then who you didn't get. And so the idea that
Mm.
maybe who can tell this story is very much reflected in the participants that you got to volunteer. And I found that really fascinating. So tell us a little bit about what you found so far.
Yeah, so all of the participants themselves, they are not in a relationship with the person who raped them, with the perpetrator, and so they had the
Mhm.
child kind of outside of that relationship, and only 2 of them have contact with the child's father to some limited extent. So you're right, it's really interesting that this is the demographic of participants who came forward rather than maybe women who are still in relationships.
I think there were two that conceived in the context of intimate partner violence. Is that right? Maybe I've got that wrong. Or was it just one?
Yes, one was a husband and one was a boyfriend. So yeah, two were conceived within the context of intimate partner violence, IPV, but they left the relationship incredibly soon after that event, that occurrence of sexual violence.
And the rest were a kind of variety of circumstances.
Yeah, so there was a few friends, a few strangers, a family member who wasn't a partner.
And thinking about the demographics, you did mention it. The children are all quite young at this point, I think. Isn't that right?
Yeah, so all of the children are daughters. So I haven't got any mothers of sons.
What do you think that's about?
I'm not really sure. I'm wondering if it's more about how my participants heard about the study rather than mothers of sons not wanting to come forward. I'm wondering if they're part of some sort of support group, whether kind of online. I think online because they're spread out over the UK. So maybe an online support group that might be specific towards mothers with daughters. But it is interesting that no mothers of sons came forward. Yeah.
Well, in the literature, there are hints that gender of the child is important, but there's no actual research evidence on that. I think there's some case study interpretations and some studies of clinicians, and they're saying that it's true, but we've got no first person evidence of that. So we don't know. They've hinted at that we think gender of the child is important. And it was just interesting that you've only got mothers of daughters, but we don't really know and there's no way we can find out particularly what that means.
So all of my participants are under 30, and when the rape occurred, they were all quite young. So their children at the moment are all under 10. So it's not only just mothers of daughters that I've got, it's mothers of young children, which is really interesting because obviously some of the clients from SARSAS who sort of got my interest in this research, they were a bit older. So they were talking about their experiences through parenting the young child, but also through to that child being into adulthood and the difficulties that they experienced with an adult child born of rape as well. So it's interesting that the participants in my study haven't got to that stage yet.
Hmm.
So there is going to be there is going to be a time frame of experience missing from this research, because the children are all really young. We haven't kind of got the voices of women whose children have grown up, so we haven't got that entire kind of child developmental stage up until they were adults, and then that adult relationship. So that's another group who are missing from this research. Yeah.
Again, yeah, I think there's something there about within the wider literature, again, not based on really good research, but around identity formation for children. And what once they know what that means and when they find out, and the stories and the mother's narrative and how they shape that and what they tell their children, which with young children obviously wouldn't necessarily be an issue. So
No, so that actually did come up as a theme. There was a mixture of what my participants wanted to do. So some of them were adamant that they would tell their child what had happened to them, so the rape, and about their child being conceived from that rape. But they wanted to wait until the child was older, so they were thinking kind of mid to older teenage, so that the child could kind of fully understand and not let it affect their identity too much, because they were thinking that the child's identity would have been
mhm,
kind of more formed by that sort of age. But they thought it was really important for the child to kind of know that story and know that roots, and also for the mother to have control over that story.
mhm,
Whereas other mothers were like adamant of the opposite. They were absolutely not going to tell their child because they didn't feel like it would be helpful for that child to know. And some participants even thought that they'd tell the child that their father was dead rather than kind of have to go into their story of what had happened. So there was mixed about people's views on that.
what I think struck me particularly was that there was also something quite beautiful about the positive experiences of motherhood in whatever context, and how that baby often, I think, in some of the accounts, represented something fresh and new, and it was something very positive for these women.
Yeah, so it seemed to be a common across all of the participants that actually the pregnancy itself was relatively difficult, partly because obviously it came so soon after the trauma that they'd experienced. So the pregnancy and the trauma experience were kind of
Hmm.
linked. But as soon as the child was born, usually pretty quickly, after being given the child, after it had been born, holding the child for the first time, most of the mothers talked about kind of a connection and the beauty of their child, and how seeing their child kind of brought them inner peace, or and was a motivator for further healing. Quite often, having that child was a motivator in their healing process from trauma, and all of them described having a good relationship with their daughters at present.
And what had they, in terms of accessing help, what had the variety of participants done in getting help?
So, by help, do you mean with anyone or support services?
A bit of both. Had they told anyone, and what was their health seeking like? Who did they go to?
So all of them had help, and it was a mix. Half of the survivors had help from services. One of the survivors had help from services exclusively, in terms of there was no other kind of support around. Support service provided a lot more kind of guidance and help for them. There was a mix of other people who'd had access to therapy as well. So they predominantly sought support from their friends. So quite often there was one key support figure, and at least half the participants had that was a
Hmm.
friend, and that friend had quite often taken them in. So they were living with this friend. The friend had encouraged them to keep the pregnancy instead of termination. The friend had then promised to and did provide support. So in terms of parent kind of co-parenting that child with the participant, with the survivor, and sometimes that friend was concerned enough to. Quite often within the stories there was some element of victim blaming for what had happened to them, for the rape itself. In some cases, it was incredibly obvious and intense, that victim blaming, and in other cases, it was more subtle and kind of more aimed towards the self rather than coming from other people.
You mean that the women were blaming themselves, or that they were experiencing other people blaming
Both,
them?
both,
Right.
yeah. Um, but that was just a little nod. Um, but one of the things I did want to touch on that was common is this idea of choice, and whether my participants felt they had a choice around termination or keeping and raising the child. So for quite a few of them, it appeared that the choice was made by somebody else, and they either had to accept it or they kind of went along with it. They were really struggling with the decision about what to do, and so having somebody else make this choice for them was kind of welcomed, especially as it was quite often accompanied by promises of ongoing support. So it's just interesting to note that, because yeah, most were late teens, early 20s. Yeah, I think sometimes in the interviews I struggled to find evidence where my participant had really been offered that choice to sit down and really talk about it and really figure through what they wanted to do. Quite often it was like, my mum said this, or my friend said that I shouldn't, or it was against my faith. Um, so I just so it just felt like an important kind of theme, because obviously it wasn't their choice to get pregnant, because it was all within rape context, and then leading on from that, for quite a few of them, it wasn't their choice. It wasn't their What's the word for when you're like really sure, or like you're really verbal about something?
Affirmative, or cl clear decision making? It wasn't, I don't know. What is this word? Emphatic.
Yeah, yeah. So for most participants, it felt like they weren't really emphatic about their choice to continue with the.
So do you think it was just kind of a continuation of this loss of control, and once having gone through an experience of rape, that their voice didn't really matter as much, and it was a kind of a continuation of then what happened to them didn't matter as much. But then having the baby, when
Yeah,
I mean, I'm
possibly.
just bringing this parallel because I've done a lot of work in teenage pregnancy, and often the decisions around,
Mm,
it's presented to them because of their age, but also that it comes from a place of
yeah,
not feeling they made the decision in the first place. And so it's a continuation of not making another decision and
yeah.
kind of letting things happen. but not in a victim blaming kind
Mm,
of way, in the sense
yeah,
of the loss of agency and loss of control that sexual violence
yeah,
can be.
yeah, absolutely. And I think, it can't be ignored that
Mm,
they had a trauma experience, and so actually it's possible that making that decision about whether or not to keep the child or keep the pregnancy was too overwhelming for them, because they were struggling to engage with that decision and engage with their bodies, engage with what was going on because of that kind of trauma
mm.
response and the potential for dissociation. So somebody else kind of came along and sort of made the decision for them.
There's a couple that talked about kind of just pushing it away. The whole thing is just forgetting. I just want to forget it. I want to push it down. But and partly through their pregnancies as well, and just kind of just almost ignoring, trying to ignore the whole situation, which is a very natural response to trauma.
Yeah, of course it is, of course. And it is also really important to say that although there was talk about kind of abortion, and quite a few of them did say that I'd wished I'd aborted it, especially during that pregnancy experience because the pregnancy was quite difficult. They all then said, actually, but I'm really glad I didn't. I'm really,
Mm,
they've got a good bond with their daughter. They really appreciate having them in their lives, and kind of, as you said earlier, the beautiful nature of that mother-daughter relationship that they've got. So although there was at times that they wish they had aborted, they are really pleased that they didn't.
mm.
And
And there was a second thing. There was one you wanted to touch on, but there was a
yes.
second thing you wanted to raise.
Loss of imagined future was quite common, because obviously we've
Mm,
already said that our participants at the age that they were raped were quite young. So we're talking kind of 18, 19, 20 sort of age. And so in that age range, you really are sort of planning and putting in place things for your future. I mean, obviously we're thinking about kind of A levels, we're thinking about university, we're thinking about careers. And when you're planning to have a child, obviously you think about, I assume most people would think about how their kind of life and what they want to do with their life would be shifted, or how they adapt that around having a child. Whereas for my participants, this choice was forced on them, or this life path was forced on them through the rape. Um,
mm,
and so quite a few of them spoke about um, that loss of their imagined future, because they were planning to study at university, or were either at university doing something and they couldn't continue with that, both because
yeah.
of the trauma response that they were experiencing. Obviously there was quite a lot of depression, suicidal thoughts, PTSD experiences, but also because they were pregnant and were going to give birth to a child soon. So that came up as a theme. Although, again, it is worth noting that for some people, whilst there was this loss of the imagined future, there was also a regaining of what they wanted to do. So quite a few of them were quite adamant that they were going to go back to university, that they were going to be career women, and some of them had shifted what they wanted to study based on kind of their experience. So it felt like there was a loss, but then a regaining.
Almost like the babies are galvanizing a motive, something to work for, something to support their future. But also, I mean, it just strikes me that that will vary enormously.
Mm,
Thinking about lots of wider research around sexual violence being concentrated in areas of poverty, that those imagined futures of A levels and education wouldn't necessarily be there, and often that having children young is quite normal through generations of families, and that's absolutely fine, and that's
mm,
it's not changing a future, but the circumstances being difficult. And actually in that kind of teenage pregnancy work, often
mm,
having a child very young was that galvanizing reason to turn your life around and make sure you did provide for them, and that was really positive. Okay, you've kind
mm.
of covered a lot of what you found,
Yeah.
so I'm going to push you. You're in the middle of analysis, and you might not be wanting to think about this, but what are you hoping for from this? What
Yeah.
is it you want to see coming from?
One of the key drivers for doing this was about getting women's voices out there. And one of my participants summed it up really nicely when I asked her kind of why she wanted to do this interview.
Hmm.
And it was about sharing your stories as a way of activism. So, what I really want to do is to put out there women's voices, women's stories, so that other people in this position can read them, and hopefully that helps them to not feel alone, or helps them think about their own decisions, but also so that professionals can read it as well. Because obviously when we think about women who are experiencing rape pregnancy, it isn't just trauma therapists like myself who will have contact with these women. It will be all sorts of kind of physical health professionals. So you've got kind of all the people
Hmm.
involved kind of in pregnancy care. And I think for me, and quite a lot of the participants highlight it, is asking questions, because some of them never told their health professionals that this was a rape pregnancy. And so, because they were scared of kind of discrimination or stigma, and not getting as good care because of it being a rape
Hmm.
pregnancy, but some of the importance out there is about professionals being comfortable and knowing to ask the questions, and making sure that if they do, that survivors are then properly supported, because all of the survivors brought up the importance of support, and of talking, and of telling your story.
I think the aspect of survivors, so I'm doing a lot of wider work around
Mm,
survivors and their own healthcare, and it's really interesting that survivors who have a baby as a result of the rape are kind of forced into
yeah.
intimate health care as a direct result of their pregnancy. And what a lot of other survivors are very clear on is that they avoid at all costs
Mm,
sexual reproductive health care, anything that's invasive, anything that involves touch, anything that puts them in a in with male practitioners, or in a room where they feel vulnerable and out of control. And so the parallel piece of work that I'm doing is about survivors saying, how can you help us attend cervical
mm,
smears, or just GP services, or just general normal healthcare that I feel I can't go into. And it's just so stark that these survivors are having to go straight into that situation. And all of them, I think it was all of them, said that their pregnancies were
mm,
experienced as
yeah.
quite difficult. That first immediate need of maternity care sensitive to survivors' needs seems like a really easy first step to do something
Mm.
about that.
Yeah, because I think, if health professionals are asking the right questions, and creating an environment where survivors feel comfortable to share, because obviously the questions can't just be, a tick box perfunctory question on a sheet. It's a very kind
Mm,
of intimate and personal topic to discuss, and so there needs to be that relationship there, and creating that bond. And then based on that, care and support can be tailored, and also survivors can be signposted to other areas of support, because some of the participants highlighted that they would have liked to have got support, but they didn't know where to go, because obviously sometimes,
mhm,
unless you're kind of in the field of mental health, or that sort of support, you don't know what's out there, you don't know the search terms to use on Google or what other search engines. And so
mm,
having health professionals build that relationship where survivors can open up, and then they can be signposted to get additional support, is really important. Because, as you said, that sort of maternity care, that sort of s- that is the first contact probably most survivors with a pregnancy from rape. Those are the first professionals they'll come into contact with, and so they've got a real opportunity to help the survivor get extra support to improve their kind of journey, both through the pregnancy but also through their healing journey.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of an early intervention mechanism that's built into
Mm,
the experience, and that so many survivors do not tell for such a long time until there's
yeah.
kind of really pressing need because mental health issues,
Yeah.
coping mechanisms, etc. Okay, well, you've told us loads about this, so I'm gonna not go on and on and on about it. But I just wanted you to maybe have a little think about, how do you think this research has changed your practice as a therapist who specializes in supporting survivors? Or is it still permeating?
I think, as with a lot of things we do as therapists, there is obviously going to be the importance of reflection, and thinking about how it's impacted me, and how that will impact my practice. And that reflection obviously does take time. But I think it's given me a greater depth of understanding of the complexities that my clients any clients who come with this difficulty will face. But in some ways, it's also made me a bit more confident in asking the question. If the client is telling me their story, and there's something that kind of flags for me, that I'm like, okay, maybe this is a rape pregnancy, whether it's from an intimate partner, or whether it's from somebody else. It's given me confidence to kind of ask the question, because I feel like I've got more of a base of knowledge behind me now, from hearing the experiences of my participants, and from doing the analysis. So yeah, increase confidence in asking the questions so that then I can better support my clients. And obviously, if they answer yes to the question but they don't want to go into it, that's absolutely fine, 100% their choice. But if they want to talk more about it and explore that a bit more, I'm better equipped to do that with them, I think.
And I think it's just so important that you're doing this, because it's not hard to do better because there's nothing. So more than nothing, it's got to be better than nothing. So I think with our slightly ridiculous calculations of trying to work out how common this might actually be, and yet how silent, so devastatingly silent it is.
Yeah, and it has come up obviously a little bit more over the last few years in the media. There was the TV show The English, from the BBC, which I think had a rape pregnancy part of their story. The other
Hmm.
week on Death in Paradise, there was a rape pregnancy storyline there.
Oh.
Again, BBC have done a few documentaries, I think, with women survivors, and spoken to actually the children who were conceived from rape. So there is a few bits and pieces out there, kind of in the media, in public awareness, but it's very limited and very small. And you're right,
Hmm.
I started this research in what, 2023, and we're now in 2025, and it seems, obviously seems crazy that this is the first kind of study of its kind in the UK. I'm really looking at this issue.
Well, thank you very much for being happy to talk about it. Is there anything you want to say that I haven't asked you about, that you feel you desperately need to add this bit?
I mean, only just my appreciation for, my participants for being brave enough
Yeah,
to come and talk to me and to share their experiences, and also Little Row and SARSAS for supporting me as well.
yeah. Great work. They're doing great work.
Mhm.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah,
Thank
and
you.
good luck with your doctoral
Thank
study.
you.